So thank you, everyone. Thank you for the invitation once again, Sepideh, and thanks everyone for being here. Thanks for the discussion last time. I was thinking a lot about how we ended off last week, speaking about what's on everyone's mind, artificial intelligence, and so on. So I thought I'd start kind of from there, from kind of try to let me see now. I can't see my notes here. I'm trying to evoke the idea that that scientific progress might be coming to an end. This kind of modern idea that that science just will keep progressing forever. We've known for a while that Moore's law, that everyone knows, is leveling off. The idea that microprocessors keep getting smaller and smaller, and processing power increases, every 6 months, it like doubles every, every year or whatever. It's now we're coming close to hitting some kind of material limits, and so these are actual material limits, and we're to the point where the microprocessor, the process for constructing them gets so small that the communication channels get so small that actually quantum tunneling potentially happens. So bits flip without you wanting them to, and then obviously making computing impossible. So that's happening. We have here Paul Dirac, who's speaking about the golden age of theoretical physics, saying that there was a large mass of spectroscopic data accumulated at the time, and Heisenberg found the proper way of handling it. In doing so, he started the golden age of theoretical physics, and for a few years after that, it was easy for any second-rate student to do first-rate work. So people were getting Nobel Prizes and whatnot. And it's the idea that after, straight out of the gates, when there's a new kind of paradigm, new technological paradigm that establishes itself, there's lots of low-hanging fruit that are there, theoretically there for the picking. Like, you just have to show up, and you're probably going to find something that someone's never seen before. And so that's what he was talking about. But that golden age has passed, and we're seeing diminishing returns. And with increased investment, we've never invested so much in the sciences, and are building these giant super gliders and accelerators and giant telescopes and things to see further and further out, and spending masses of money on these projects. The LHC, for example, is the largest, most complex technological device ever built or conceived. And the fear is that the only thing it'll ever find is the Higgs boson, which it already did. And so the fear is that it only just confirms what we already knew was probably there. So we built all this, we did all of this, and then we end up not really learning anything substantial. So there's this idea going around in science and science, science writing and science. Some scientists themselves, physicists, are themselves concerned about this, that the low-hanging fruit have all been plucked, and you have various physicists writing and thinkers writing about this, that science is getting less bang for its buck. Papers and patents are becoming less disruptive over time. And actually, and this is a good point, is that the measure of science is not the measure of patents and publications. You know, there's a lot of publications, but we've never thrown more money at academia. There are more like PhDs than ever before, and there's more research happening. So yes, there are more kind of quote unquote discoveries and publications and patents and all this. So we would, by just looking at that, we would kind of have this skewed idea that that science is really progressing, but actually the disruptive power of those ideas is diminishing over time. And if you think about it, in the time of Dirac, in the time of the early quantum mechanics, you could do physics with a pen and paper, theoretical physics on the edge of a table, and author a paper on your own. And today, the publications coming out of the LHC, for example, have dozens of co-authors attached to them. And so you see my point. There's a lot of people have been talking about this, notably Lee Smolin back in the early 2000s was saying that there was a big problem with this. In the 80s, when we kind of figured out the loose ends of particle physics and the standard model, and then afterwards nothing. It was kind of like, no, then it was just a search for the ways to unify gravity with particle physics and figure out quantum gravity. But and actually John Horgan back in 1999 had a very kind of a science writer for Scientific American was making that point as well in the late 90s. That the string theory, for example, that was being touted as this was going to be like the way to tie everything together. It's just so underdetermined by any data, any kind of empirical science that we can actually have. Like there's no way to test out like which one of the string theories, for example, would be right. Like there's dozens of equivalent as their explanatory value, they're equivalent, but we can't test which one would be right. So they're kind of underdetermined by the empirical data, and there's no straightforward way of like figuring out what we could build to test it, or what we could create, what kind of testing device, like experimental apparatus we could use to test these ideas. Same thing is true for most of the other, like loop quantum gravity as well. So it's doesn't look good. So, so that's kind of where we left off last time, about thinking about the kind of resource sensitivity of logic and science. And I just wanted to put it out there right now that it could be that that's the way things work, that we might be kind of coming to an end of science because we just simply won't have the resources to go any further, and it'll just kind of end at this level of kind of knowledge. We'll just fill out then all the little kind of questions of this and that, and all the little the smaller problems, but then there would be these huge problems that never get resolved, and so forth. And so, yeah, and this is related to the AI question as well, because a lot of people, the kind of alarmists, who are saying things like like Nick Bostrom, or these people who come out and say as soon as AI is smart enough, AGI or whatever, it's going to kill everyone. It's going to be evil AI, and it's going to want to kill everyone. It's going to be so much more intelligent than we are, that it will just think we're insignificant and just, end up squashing us as we do flies. It will just be a nuisance, and it'll just kind of. So, but this idea that science is resource sensitive also would have an effect on AI, because other people like François Chollet, the French developer of Keras, it's a library for doing TensorFlow in Python, and it works. It works quite well. And I had a chance to kind of dabble with it back in Aarhus with NLP and things like that. And anyway, smart guy. And he says from his point of view, this idea that science is slowing down will also have an effect on AI. If AI then becomes that intelligent, so yeah, straight out of the gates, it will make huge improvements. It'll get much smarter very quickly, exponentially so very quickly. But then it'll reach similarly bottlenecks, and it'll also run into a slowdown, and will reach resource sensitive aspects. Like, in order to get any further, so it'll pluck all the low-hanging fruit, but then once those are picked, they become harder and harder to reach and demand more energy, more time, etc. Okay, so that was a bit of preamble. I'm going to start with John Wheeler's Parlor Game. This is an old BBC documentary that had John Archibald Wheeler, American physicist, talking about his idea of participatory universe using this example of a parlor game. And do nod if you, or tell me if you don't hear it, because we tested it earlier, but it should work.
Some years ago, I found myself playing the game of 20 questions after dinner with a dozen friends. And one by one, we had our turn to be sent out of the room and be let back in to guess the word that everyone else had picked on. But in my case, I was shut out the longest time. And when I was let back in, everybody had a grin on his face, the sign of some joke or trick, I was sure. But I went ahead innocently with my questions. And I noticed as I asked them, it took each person longer and longer to decide. And I was so puzzled. All I wanted was a simple yes or no. But finally, I knew I had to pick some word. Is it cloud, I said. And my friend thought and thought and thought. And finally, he said yes. And everybody in the room burst out laughing. And then they explained to me that when I came in the room, there was no word. They had agreed not to agree on a word. Everybody could answer as he pleased, with only one proviso that all answers should be consistent. So it was just as hard for them as it was for me. And
okay. So, due to the role played by observation within quantum mechanics, American physicist John Archibald Wheeler popularized a way of thinking about the universe as participatory. The universe comes into being through successive attempts to see, study it, and know it. Every empirical observation is like pinching ourselves to see if we're not dreaming. It is as though each scientific observation asks, am I still here? And the answer in Wheeler's Parlor Game can only be yes. Echoing Karl Popper, we might say that what should stand as real is just whatever resists being unmasked as unreal. The full light of day is precisely what knowledge is denied in principle. Progress can only be made in the other direction, that is, by accepting that we are not fully right, but moving on anyway with our best hunches. Leibniz said that if we had waited for certainty, we would never have taken a first step. And thus that indistinction and uncertainty were a necessary first step. Everything gets started with a random leap out into the unknown, a guess, a hunch. Indeed, there is a random, chaotic, non-linear aspect at the root of any pragmatic movement in the direction of knowledge and intelligibility. Knowledge always fakes it until it makes it, so to speak. Ex falso quodlibet. From false premises, something follows. As long as we keep everything consistent, after the first inconsistent step, everything will turn out fine. And so that's what I have here, continuing the same kind of drawings we had with the, we had these diagrams from absurdity to truth. And actually absurdity, like we said at the end, is precisely the type in type theory which has no constructors, but within which we could say all constructors somehow exist, because you can get from absurdity to anywhere else. That's what it means in logic. This idea of the principle of explosion, which is ex falso quodlibet, ex falsum. It means that from a contradiction, if P and not P, P and not P, therefore Q, or therefore, any number of different things could be proved. Like if you can prove a contradiction, then everything else, you can prove basically anything else, absurd things. You could prove that unicorns exist and things like that. And we saw in type theory that they kind of tamed paradox by creating this bottom type, this empty type, where they basically stuff down all the paradoxes. So in his early notes, Nietzsche projected that his philosophy would be an inverted Platonism. The farther removed from true being, the purer, the finer, the better it is. Living in semblance as goal, he said. He surmised that Plato's allegory of the cave had misinterpreted or misrepresented the evolution of thought. Instead of coming out of the cave into the light of knowledge, we have perhaps never really escaped the cave of simulations. We rather might have chased the shadows ever further into the darkness, tracing their nested projections and abstractions, progressively insulating ourselves from the drama occurring on the surface. Such is the asymmetry of empirical cognition and science. Our assumptions can be proved wrong, but they can never be proved right. We go down dark alleys until we discover a dead end. As was shown by Turing's Entscheidungsproblem, his resolution to Hilbert's Entscheidungsproblem, which we saw last week. We cannot know in advance which paths will lead to dead ends without first running through the steps of the computation. So there's a connected idea in quantum physics based on the Everett interpretation, Hugh Everett interpretation of quantum mechanics, the many worlds interpretation. As an idea about immortality. It's a flawed idea, but it's worth discussing. The idea of what it's like to be Schrodinger's cat. In the Everett interpretation, the wave function doesn't collapse, right? So the universe remains in a state of superposition. And so, which means that then every time we kind of do something, there's also another branch of reality where we don't do that same thing, or and so forth. And so it certainly does seem after Bell's theorem that the universe is fundamentally non-local, and that out there in the absolute there is no collapse into a specific causal timeline. So what then if you are Schrodinger's cat and you are both dead and alive? Everett apparently believed that this granted him a kind of or potentially anyway, I don't know if he toyed with the idea because there's conflicting evidence about it, but he toyed with the idea that that this granted him immortality because he could then you could then never die, because as long as there's one branch within which one branch of the timeline, branching timelines, where you're still conscious, still alive, then you're still experiencing somehow. So it became, after a bunch of other people, Hans Moravec, I think, was the first to kind of state it, but it's gained attention again in the late 90s and all that. The idea that quantum suicide and how you could never die, basically. The idea is it's a thought experiment where you hold a gun to your head, you close your eyes and pull the trigger, but somehow you open your eyes again and you've survived. You can do this as many times as you want. You always wake up in the world where your consciousness continues. The gun misfired or something stopped the bullet, etc. Because as in Wheeler's parlor game, the answer can only be yes. The answer, am I still alive? It can always only be yes. The universe can only answer yes to that question. The consistency of the system demands that, as we saw last week, the morphisms never be left dangling without an object. They have to land on an object. So each time you pull the trigger, from your subjective point of view, the gun misfires and you survive, even though from the point of view of all your dismayed loved ones in other parallel universe, you will have been mortally injured. And this is odd because there's like various philosophical precursors to this. Epicurus was famous for having said that death never comes. Death does not concern us, because as long as we exist, death is not here. And once it comes, we no longer exist. This is kind of like armchair philosophy of like, well, for something to exist, I need to be able to perceive it. Therefore, since I won't be conscious when I die, therefore death doesn't exist, and and so life is eternal. And it's related also to Hilary Putnam's discussion of the causal theory of reference, where he says, you know, in his working on the idea of brains in a vat. What if you're a brain in a vat, like in the Matrix? You're just a brain with wires connected to it, and all the world that you live in is just a simulation triggered by these electrical impulses. Well, he ends up, it's a complicated argument, but he ends up saying that whether or not you're a brain in a vat, whenever you say, I am a brain in a vat, the statement is false, because there is no causal link between what you're referring to. So in order for reference to work, there needs to be something that you could actually refer to. And in this case, you couldn't refer to the fact of the world being simulated. So this evokes to me, anyway, something that was recently in the news, this kind of VR headset that kills the player of a video game if he dies in the game. There's like bullets or like some kind of it fires shots directly into your brain if you die in the game. And it was created by one of the founders of Oculus Rift as a kind of, I don't know, as a kind of, I don't know if it's a joke or it's an odd object, but it's certainly related to what we were talking about last week with the kind of logic of the immaterialist or dualistic short time loop films, where it's like the logic of a game, right? Where you can always, if you die in the game, you can always start over. And well, this puts an end to that, right? It puts an end to that only if this quantum immortality is wrong, right? Because if quantum immortality is right, which it probably isn't, but it's not the right way of thinking about it. But this would be a great way of testing quantum immortality, you know, by using this virtual reality suicide machine. So now, the film that I referenced as a kind of the multiverse exemplar, the kind of multiverse version of killing your doubles. Whereas last time we were talking about time and time loops and that kind of paradox. Now we're talking about quantum superposition and quantum coherence. So this film from 2013 sets it up this way. There's a kind of these friends are collected together at someone's house for a dinner party, and they there's some kind of comet coming close to Earth, and strange things happen when this comet comes by. And for example, they've read in the paper that there was in 1918, the last time this comet came by, there's a woman who called the police the next day and said, "There's a man in my house who is not my husband." And then the cops show up and say, "Well, this is your husband. What's wrong? Like, this is your husband." And she says, "No, this is not my husband. I killed my husband last night. That's how I know it's not him." So they set this up right at the beginning of the film. And of course, what happens is that when the comet shows up, there's a kind of astronomical event that creates a kind of superposition of their house. So there's multiple houses like this in this dark street. So they go outside, and then there's another house at the 2 blocks away that looks just like theirs and also has dinner guests and whatnot. And it's all like clones or copies of the dinner guests. There's slightly different versions of them, and they end up the kind of drama unfolds, and they end up mixed up and whatnot, and they end up killing their doubles in order to take their place. So same idea as last week. This is what happens here. There can be no clones, which is another quantum physical idea, eliminating clones. There is no cloning. So what is this idea of coherence and decoherence? Coherence is like the wave function, you know, the quantum system. If you don't touch it, if you don't observe it, and if you don't let it, that's the important thing, if you don't let it interact with anything, with the environment, then it remains in a coherent state, which is this idea of superposition. It's, in a way, it's non-locality. Its properties are smeared out in a kind of probability distribution. It's neither here nor there. It's kind of spread out in space as a potential. And so in order to keep it that way, you need to keep it very cold because as soon as there's any kind of heat, it decoheres. Actually, decoherence is the fastest process in nature, I believe. It happens, before you even have a chance to. I mean, I think that scientists are now able to keep macroscopic objects, not macro, but like mesoscopic objects, so kind of medium-sized objects in a coherent state by freezing them down to like close to 0 Kelvin, and then they could kind of, which is, and decoherence is also the problem with quantum mechanics, with quantum computing, where these quantum computers need to be cooled in order to keep the qubits from decohering, and just you lose the information. So you have to keep them very, very, very cold, and you have to build in a lot of parallel gates that make sure that you can error correct and whatnot. So this diagram I'm showing you here is from a very famous paper about decoherence, about this idea that we used to think that there was kind of like, oh, small things are quantum and large things are classical in nature, So there was this border, this strict border, like small things are just quantum in nature and large things are not, or like classical, like billiard ball type of causality, where things are here or there and are here or now and later, whereas in quantum physics, in the quantum coherent realm, things are here and there, and things are here, or things are now and then, and things are moving back in time. Effects are moving in both forward and backwards in time. So that is related to what we were talking about last week with this and or business. There is a kind of natural movement in nature from this and from this andness to this orness. That's what decoherence is. Decoherence is kind of like the spread out process of kind of nature moving from andness to orness, or from a kind of quantum state where everything is, where properties are smeared out to where they're kind of decided. But what decoherence emphasizes is that it's not just a collapse. It's not just like one moment. It's constantly happening, and it's constantly happening around us as we're kind of interacting with the environment. Anything else I wanted to show here? Well, it could be a good moment to show a little bit of what I wanted to emphasize with this and or business. Here's just a little bit of, this is just a bit of fun with the graphics, because the and or logical symbols kind of look like the shape of the category theoretic way of drawing these the product and co-product. They're kind of triangles, and this is basically an and gate. This is basically an or gate in Boolean logic. So there's this idea that, and now we're going downwards. I just drew it downwards so that you get, this familiar shape. The logical symbols for and or kind of fit with this way of thinking about it. So let's say time is moving downwards in this section, and we have here absurdity moving to truth, and here we have something that's peculiar to the quantum the categorical understanding of quantum mechanics, which is it's a diagrammatic way of thinking and reasoning with quantum mechanics. And so some of you might be familiar with the Dirac notation. Dirac was that guy we saw earlier, where you have a bra and a ket. And so these together give you the scalar, kind of the inner product, which gives you the probability distribution that that a system will be in phi when taken on the basis psi, I believe. I might be getting that mixed up. So it might be backwards. I'm not sure if I'm getting that right. But so anyway, one of them is one of them is like a question, and the other one is a response. One of them is like setting up an experiment, and the other one is this one. So this would be setting up an experiment. The ket, it's like a question, and the bra is like the result of the measurement. And together, it gives you this kind of probability distribution that you'll get one of what you'll get if you test for one basis. So that's called we talked about how quantum physics and the category that describes quantum physics last time is equivalent to linear logic, closed symmetric monoidal categories, which do not have a Cartesian product. And that's what we're talking about here. They don't have a Cartesian product, but they do have a tensor product, and in particular, an inner product, which gives us this. All right. So I just wanted to evoke that. So let's see. Oh, before I go on here, there's this idea to recall the terms that Jean-Yves Girard, the guy who came up with linear logic, uses. This idea of expansivity, the expansivity of empirical observation never completely matches up with the recessivity of theoretical formulation. The transition between quantum and classical involves an arbitrary action, that we do something, so that we measure something, we observe something, or that we interact with it, with the system. Hence the return of intuitionistic thinking, the BHK interpretation, programs as proofs and propositions as types, and Curry-Howard isomorphism in science, is not a question of true and false, but a question of true and absurd. You can prove absurdity, but ex falsum quodlibet, absurdity always spits you back out. Decoherence is the fastest process in nature. So I started last week's talk with a foreshadowing of some of the stuff I wanted to talk about in this week's talk about concerning evolution and the reason why we think of things causally, if they're not actually, if things are not that way to begin with, if things out there are non-causal, or at least not in the old like classical causality, why is it that we ended up thinking that things were that way? There's reason to believe that has to do with story and narrative, and how we develop our deep sense of experience and self-consciousness. These emerge as evolutionarily conditioned, chemically induced emotional overdeterminations of the information transfer and communication. In other words, it may be an artifact of the noise introduced by the compression algorithms required to produce language as a signal into transmittable packets of information that are digestible by a human with its limited amount of short-term memory and so on. Thus, if we take this evolutionary view, we begin to see that it is the genome itself that, in order to perpetuate itself, establishes a method of optimizing for this information to be faithfully encoded and retrieved through speech. How does it implement this? When training an AI, a deep learning neural net, we do something very similar. We encode preference for optimizing some variable, like scoring points in a game. But this optimization scheme, this reward mechanism, in our early ancestors had to do with maximizing certain flows and rushes of endogenous chemicals. An endogenous reward mechanism was established between evolutionary pressures on the genome and the human brain's weighting of various aspects of its continuous modeling of the world. Perhaps, in fact, there is no model to speak of before this translation into a relation between the ego and the complex of states of affairs. This is something various researchers into the kind of so-called science of storytelling tell us. We know that the signatures of narrative comprehension light up in the brain before they become conscious, or before we can explicitly talk about them. So it's as if to say that the brain makes language digestible for this other thing, which is consciousness, let's say. Consciousness sees itself reduced not to the global workspace, but to a kind of reward mechanism, an emotional overdetermination of communication. So our sense of identity is closely connected to these narratives, as psychoanalysis made clear. But chemically speaking, we know that this corresponds to an orchestration of hormones, neurotransmitters, and other endogenous chemicals. Narrative centers in the brain light up, and oxytocin and dopamine and serotonin are released in orchestration with what our genomes, in effect, are optimizing our brains to communicate. How we select the relevant information in the world around us, what we remember, what we act on, and what we communicate, and our accounting of what happens are all these effects are effects of how evolution will have set things up in the background, how it optimized our endogenous drug system. So forget zombie fungus. We're already like zombie junkies, wandering through the world seeking our next fix with our transcendental evolutionary background, our genome, pulling the strings behind the scenes. Take the fight or flight response, this experience of being in a state of emergency where at any moment we should have to act decisively to quickly exit the situation or enter into a confrontation. This is produced in the brain by a flush of cortisol and adrenaline. Our paraventricular thalamus releases cortisol, and we perk up and take attention. We focus on the scene before us and forget and drop whatever else we might be doing, and really become aware of our surroundings. This is a state of tension that is then only relaxed when the threat or potential source of danger is gone, when the predator has passed us by, or when the strange sound has been explained by some inoffensive source, like a tumbling rock or something. Cortisol is the stress hormone released in those moments of stress. It is also what floods the body when the body is in a state of drug withdrawal, as we wait for a fix. When the cortisol-fueled moment of tension has found an inoffensive probable cause, our genomes then downregulate our amygdala's response and we return to a state of relative normalcy where we can go on. And I say where we can go on in the sense of Wittgenstein, and the late Wittgenstein thought a lot about this, how proof theory works. We'll come back to it. Where we can continue on our regular tasks and not be in a state of worry or shock. When we fulfill an important task, we're flooded with the reward chemicals that make us feel warm and fuzzy, proud of ourselves, etc. Glutamate, for its part, is responsible for triggering the production of memories and learning. Oxytocin makes us care. It makes us empathic to others. It gets released into our brain, and our priorities change to taking attention to those around us and to their well-being. So when we think we have understood what someone is saying, when we have retrieved the relevant information and memory, we're rewarded with a bump of neurochemicals. And so our brains are already under the control of our genomes. We are junkies for endopharmaca, and our genome is the only dealer in town. Here's a picture of Pavlov with his dog, with a dog. Everyone's heard about this. We often hear people talking about Pavlov's dog as, the dog's reaction or salivation when he smells a steak is supposed to be natural and unconditioned, whereas the dog's salivation when he hears the bell ring is a conditioned response. People say it is natural to salivate when the steak is present. It is a learned response to salivate when the bell rings But in reality, all natural responses in evolutionary terms are just as conditioned. They are, in a sense, learned on the level of our genome through environmental pressures over evolutionary time. This complex orchestration of brain chemicals, this continual pulsation of hormones, is how our genomes will have learned to animate within our brains to get us to survive and procreate. The life of the mind with its successions of emotional states is directly the consequence of this complicated and messy process. And again, it's because we're complex organisms. We have to underscore how this is particularly the territory of advanced biological entities, of complex life with a multi-layer structure where there's this orchestration between multiple levels of biological tissues and structural scales, which was not possible before the evolution of complex organisms, which means it also requires that sexed life have come onto the scene and the possibilities of genetic recombination to have been exploited. Last week, we discussed briefly Aristotle's three-act theory of narrative, and we talked about composition in terms of that. But invariably, in the hormonal semantics, if you will, of storytelling, this implies a series of pulsations in our endogenous drugs from the first act, where oxytocin and serotonin are typically released. A good story makes the listener or reader care about the protagonist. So we need to put ourselves in their shoes, such that their trials and challenges then become chemically lived as our own. The story's central challenge is presented in the second act. If the first act worked, and we care about the protagonist, then we're now rooting for them, and our brain is flooded with cortisol as we experience a state of tension, and we're literally on the edge of our seats. The third and final act usually describes a resolution where our amygdalas relax the tension and we are rewarded with warm and fuzzies. A story is like just one segment of a line that is traced throughout our lives through the composition of such sequences of pulsations and hormones. We compose these segments into a larger life story. Our sense of ourselves is composed of these trials, these transformations. So another point we touched on last week, but we should bring it back now. It's these kinds of biological structures, these complex, multi-layered, complex organism structures that will have imposed the prohibition of incest and the prohibition of loops on the genetic level. For the entire thrust of recombination is to separate the genes in order to recombine them, in order for rapid evolution to take place. So incest was, in fact, is in a way the old method of evolution, where single-celled life forms randomly exchange genetic data in a horizontal orgy, where all generations are welcome and so on. But there was a kind of asymmetrical diffusion into this new space represented by recombination, which we can speculate had this effect of kind of imposing this prohibition of incest. So in artificial intelligence, and what about artificial intelligence in terms of this? We're now figuring out how to produce architectures and machines that are able to learn as well. And the deep learning architectures we're now interacting with on a daily basis are based on this idea of neural net, a simple idea which goes back 50 years or so, but only recently has the computing power and the training data been available to really get much out of them. So many thinkers concerned, in traditional AI, still connected to like GoFi, good old-fashioned AI, as they called it, where they were trying to like figure out kind of how logic works in order to kind of build machines that were logical. And like Noam Chomsky, who recently said in his New York op-ed, we talked about this a little bit in the questions last week, but he says that he critiques this kind of system, and there's been this kind of system has been critiqued for decades, but it's only now that it's like really proving itself. It's really kind of obviously very powerful. But he's still saying, oh, these machines still can't reason causally. They still can't figure out the reason for something. They're just kind of guessing the next word, the most probable word, and just guessing what the next word should be and just making it up as it goes along. It doesn't really understand anything, doesn't know anything. So I hope that what I've been showing you this week and last week should be suggesting and maybe convincing you that this is not really anything to be particularly proud of. The kind of this way of thinking about causality is a bias. It's a bias in humans, which we probably should be trying to get over rather than celebrate and pat ourselves on the back about. Actually, we should be trying to see beyond our endo addiction to this kind of causal storytelling if you want to come to grips with the way things really are beyond the human. So there's this result developed in many ways for different kinds of neural nets called the universal the universal approximation theorem. It basically says that given enough time and resources, enough training data, these neural nets can resolve a function to an arbitrary degree of precision. If there's a function out there, it can approximate it. It's an old idea that has got a lot to do with the birth of computing and the digital, and this idea of substrate independence, and whether you can simulate a world to an arbitrary degree of precision and not know the difference, or these kinds of questions. But it's been proven for various deep learning approaches, including these ones here, sigmoid, this sigmoid function and this feed-forward network. The thing I want to point out is that they all use this activation function. It's all of these universal approximation theorems, as far as I know, they all make use of this nonlinear activation. Without it, it's not really universal. So, and these activation functions are nonlinear, meaning that it's kind of it's a rule that's applied from the outside of the system. It's not implied by the data. It's not learned by the system, but it's imposed on it from the outside. So it's nonlinear in that sense. So we just, for example, in ReLU, this is one of these activation functions, which is rectified linear unit. We just, if x is less than or equal to 0, then we just clamp it to 0. X just equals 0. So we get rid of all the negative numbers. And then we just pass the positive numbers. If x is greater than 0, then pass the x as is, untouched. And then there's other ones. There's different ways, different nonlinear activation functions like tanh, sigmoid, softmax. They all do various things like that to kind of, basically what you're doing is, your neural net is passing on this data and giving weights to this layer. And then before you pass it on to the next layer, you do something to the data, like you clean it up and you get rid of some of the noise, and you basically you boost the contrast, or you kind of make the image a little bit crisper and more salient, so that you're wasting less computational resources. You're kind of speeding things up, and so you're getting more quickly to the salient aspects of what you're trying to learn. And it turns out that it's very important which one of these various different activation functions you use, because it completely changes the resulting behavior. And it's sometimes called the kind of alchemical aspect. The alchemy in AI today has to do with this. Like we train these models, and then we go ahead and we tweak them just a little bit, and then then this is what happened with the GPT. We want to make it, we have this big, huge model, but then it just doesn't sound right, and then we kind of just tweak it a little bit so that it's a little bit more human, or a little bit more a nicer, or we give it a little bit of a shove, but we don't actually know exactly like the science of this. It's kind of a little bit mysterious. We just try different things and we get different results, but we're not sure what, like, the causal link between how we're applying these nonlinear activation functions and the resulting behavior. So Wittgenstein, I promised I would talk about Wittgenstein just a little bit, and this idea of now I can go on, because it's related to this. In his later work, there was this recurring question about what is a proof, or when are we satisfied with a solution to a problem? There's a moment where the tension of the problem is released or satisfied, and now I can go on. I can go on to the next thing. So he worried that there was a kind of non-linearity in that process, because it just seems like there's a jump. There's a kind of, okay, now we can go on. And so it's kind of an empty space, a gap between the moment where we're still concerned with the problem and unsatisfied with the answer, and the moment where we're not, where we accept that the solution has been found. So a good example was then he said, there's a teacher and their student, and the student is making mistakes some percentage of the time, and at some point, so as long as it's under a certain percentage, we're like, okay, the student still doesn't get it, so we have to continue the lesson, and we can't go on to the next one. But then at some point, we're satisfied. And it's usually not 100%, right? The student will still go on to make mistakes forever, like they'll never be perfect, and yet we're satisfied to go on to the next step. So what is it? Is it 70%? Where's that line? Is it 70%? Is it 90%? So that's what I mean by this question of nonlinearity. There's this kind of alchemical aspect to it. It gives the system an apparent universality, and where it can approximate a function to an arbitrary degree of precision, but we're not sure in what way. Like different ones will give different efficiency results and whatnot. And notice how this is also connected to Juliana Pearl that we talked about, who discussed the difference between causal inference and mere correlation, where correlational inference, we had arrows going in every which direction, and in causal inference, we have a directed graph with no loops. It's acyclic, right? And that imposition of acyclicality, so something we didn't talk about last week, is the do calculus, because the reason causality looks that way, you can turn a correlational system into a causal one by doing something, by intervening, by picking up one of those arrows and saying, I did this, or I did this. So you know that by doing something, you know something about the influences on the system. And that's what begins to direct all the other lines. It gives a kind of causal direction to the remaining system. So I'd like to say that the evolutionary pressure to orient the arrows, to order the sequence in terms of instructions for how to get from here to there, subtends Julia Pearl's analysis of causal inference. He emphasizes that to ask for causality rather than mere correlation is to ask that there not be any feedback loops in our diagram. So all the arrows must be going in the same direction. Importantly, he demonstrates that this implies an intervention to pass from correlation, where the arrows go in all directions, to causation. We must erase certain arrows, or equivalently, we must do something, act on the scene, such that some causes, our own, are known. Causality is the question of what happens when one does something. It's also related to Bayesian thinking, Bayes' theorem, which I guess the followers of this platform will have looked at more closely with Anna Longo, and she does that quite well. But there's this idea that you begin with a guess and attribute. You just guess. You attribute some arbitrary value on your own ignorance to begin with, and then you incrementally update it from there, right? So now, skepticism, something I've worked on quite a bit and comes back a lot in my work. There's these two schools of skepticism. The Pyrrhonian school of skepticism, influenced by the teachings of Pyrrho of Elis, practiced a rigorous mode of rational reflection aimed at bringing to light the paradoxes and aporia beneath all forms of judgment. Diogenes Laertius reported that Pyrrho led a life of agnosticism and suspension of judgment, which would later become the cornerstone of the skeptical school bearing his name. The point was to hold no beliefs, to withhold judgment about the state of affairs, to avoid imposing upon the world any unfounded inferences or interpretations. The goal was that of achieving ataraxia, freedom from disturbance. For the Pyrrhonists, all judgments lack rigor. All judgments could be revealed to rely on unsubstantiated dogma. So Laertius says that he led a life consistent with his doctrine, going out of his way for nothing, taking no precaution, but facing all risks as they came, whether carts, precipices, dogs, or whatnot, and generally leaving nothing to the arbitrariment of the senses, but he was kept out of harm's way by his friends who used to follow close after him. So these stories are told about him where because he was so skeptical, he didn't even trust his own kind of gut feeling that, you know, he was going to get you know, severely injured if he walked into oncoming traffic, or if he walked off of the cliff, and he had these friends would just pull him back from the precipice. So this was a perspective of skeptical philosophy, to not be motivated by the appearances gleaned through the senses. The Pyrrhonists, later on, notably Sextus Empiricus, develop a whole theory of equipollence, strategies for showing that all arguments are wrong, that all judgments are ultimately self-contradictory, and that nothing can allow us to rigorously choose between one way of interpreting things and another. This is meant to free us from worries and achieve ataraxia, because by knowing this, we're supposed to be freed of like the duty of having to figure it out, like by all these problems that are just difficult to figure out. So we just know, oh, actually, we know rigorously that there is no way to figure them out. Therefore, go on and live your life. But this is to be contrasted with the other form of skepticism, the academic skepticism developed in Plato's Academy in Athens, where the goal was not to enjoy this equipollence for its own sake, but where it serves a rather pragmatic purpose. It's meant to just be an important step on the way to knowledge. And so it's the idea of accepting that we don't know which argument is right, but with the kind of supposition that maybe one day we will be able to decide between these different judgments and opinions. So rather than just blindly following the most obvious, okay, so wait. So yes, so it was the idea that we should accept a certain amount of uncertainty rather than just blindly following the most obvious experience of appearances. Academic skepticism is pragmatic in this sense. It assumes that we can incrementally improve. And indeed, I see it as a precursor of Bayesian thinking, Bayesianism, this incremental improvement, optimization through an assessment of uncertainty, through an acceptance and an assessment of our own ignorance. So Pyrrhonism, for its part, is much like a pragmatic seizure of opposing inclinations, of opposing arguments, conflicting interpretations, such that they form a kind of balance, such that they avoid being reduced one way or another, like the delicate symmetry of a house of cards. Pyrrhonism corresponds to what I've called provocatively pure reason. Pure reason, not in the Kantian sense, but in the sense that it is absolutely conditioned. It's so conditioned that it can't act. It does not allow any inferences that are not absolutely conditioned. So that's why it remains suspended with, it suspends judgment. It does not allow, as Bayesianism does, one to make an impure rational decision, such as choosing, such as, guessing to make a first step, choosing some kind of arbitrary value to attribute to our ignorance. In practical reason, we're forced to act before it's too late, as per the pressures of evolution. If you don't do something before it's too late, if you don't defer to the best guess, even if it isn't perfect, and conditionalize your inference on it, you will be quickly deleted by evolutionary selection. So evolution quickly produces creatures that are good at guessing and acting on their best hunches, even though they are biased. We can say in this way that artificial intelligence, this is something I said last week, artificial general intelligence cannot evolve. There is a sense in which the most general intelligence converges on the incapacity to act. This is what is made obvious in the frame problem, this old problem in artificial intelligence, where not only must the decision take place rationally, it must take place within pragmatic time. It has to happen within the time where the practical result is still warranted. And today, this problem is still not really solved. It's not solved philosophically, at least. It's kind of just it's outsourced. It's outsourced to human observers. So today, for example, we train our current transformer neural nets to pay attention to the right thing or the right part of the sentence, but we don't really, it's not always clear why that is. This question of context is very, very difficult to pin down. So while the academic pessimism is practical, it is nonlinear. It has this aspect where you apply this rule. You make a guess and you go with your hunch. It allows for this kind of deferral to the next best thing after certainty, which is your best guess, and potentially diminishing your amount of uncertainty over time incrementally. While Pirot was a kind of idealist and would have, if he were an AI technician today, would reject the use of the activation function and want each move to be absolutely linear. So to wrap things up, evolutionary pressures on our most ancient ancestors will have wanted their functions to compose. They will have wanted their stories to be ordered from beginning to middle to end, and shaped our habits such that we are addicted to the sequences of hormonal pulsations that constitute our brain system of reward and punishment, giving primitive intelligibility and a hormonal semantics to the world of our mammalian ancestors. The constitution of objectivity is also the pacification of incredulity. Perhaps the evolving intuition described in various accounts of mathematical and logical praxis is actually just patterns of hormonal stimulation in our brains. So again, this idea of now I can go on might be literally something having to do with the amygdala and cortisol levels. Where your response kind of comes down, and now you just feel like you can go on to the next thing. Those thresholds and cusps, those key points, Simondon fantasized about in his speculative account of pre-signifying experience, were no doubt moments where our ancestors' brains were flooded with different endopharmaca, the effect from one perspective of our genes biasing our minds to take this or that feature as more important than the rest and to treat them as invariant. The path between these cusps and thresholds, obstacles and milestones had to be tracked and mapped by our ancestors if we were ever to see the light of day. So on the one hand, ex nihilo nihil fit Objective consistency and normalcy must continually be reestablished. The present must be forced to the role of obvious consequence of the past. Each element in the present must be accounted for by that which precedes it and express the effect of a prior cause. As Parmenides already knew, there cannot have been a break between the before and the after, or a jump from nothing to something, and hence nothing can change stability and degradation. Degradation is denied, the avoidance of fatal thresholds. This primitive evolutionary rule may account for the directionality, the acyclicality of our graphs, the order we continually construct between the initial and the terminal conditions of our systems, the ins and outs, the lows and highs, the necessary arrow from void to unit, from falsity to truth, from and to or, from the lesses and mores of our paradigms of thought and our domains of scientific study. On the other hand, ex falso quodlibet, from false premises anything follows, and all worlds are superposed in the origin, in the chaos before the division of worlds, the paradox that chooses all objects for itself, eternally waiting for an arbitrary collapse, decision, or action. All the universal properties may emerge from a biological prohibition of summoning the void, the prohibition of indifference. The necessity to do something, to intervene. In addition to being impelled in every instant to reestablish intelligibility, to account for the present with the past, and to find explanations, reasons, and causes, we're also condemned to doubting our models and perpetually seeking to update them, propelled ever forward by empirical events that challenge our previous assumptions, by paradoxes that can only be overcome with supplements to our current capacities of exteriorization, what we may call prosthetics. It is tempting to read even our capacities to imagine unactualized possibilities and entertain counterfactualities, virtualities, disconnected from the present state of affairs, as amplifications of this very ingrained habit of deciding, selecting, and ordering quickly and efficiently before it is too late, and being forced to take shortcuts in doing so, thereby glossing over the details, masking out factors irrelevant to the survival task, and effectuating the coarse graining of nature. Perhaps this bias is the very price of life. There is no evolution outside of these constant conjunctions of pasts and futures that keep it running from one moment to the next. And it thus had to start somewhere, purely arbitrarily, perhaps. There could have been no world before a first decision, a first break in symmetry, a random deviation from the superposition of all possible worlds, a decision whereby a hastily conceived and incomplete world is indicated, distinguished, or as in Leibniz, is best. Thank you for listening. Let's have some questions, if you will. Just adjust this here. Martin.
Hey, Alex. How are
Hi.
you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. I really enjoyed your talk. It covered a lot of territory. So I'm trying to figure out what the punchline is. And I would like to get there through two examples that you use. The first example is John Wheeler. And the second example are the flight and fight and startle reflexes. So we're talking about internal, external pressures for evolution and the role of biology in evolution. And I guess one way I want to get to where this punchline lies is to talk about how fundamental assumptions shape the progress and limit the progress of knowledge. So one of the things that I notice is that a lot of the examples you use in quantum mechanics and in general relativity, speaking of Wheeler, really seem to be grounded in the reversible model of time. And Wheeler is a particular moment because I've written about Wheeler in terms of portals in the avant-garde modernist Duchamp and the postmodern novelist Pynchon with respect to black holes, white holes, wormholes, and that sort of thing. And one of the end game in terms of his life projects of Wheeler was geometric dynamics, which was really an attempt to reduce both matter and energy into geometry. And I've always wondered whether the assumptions through which Wheeler worked generated that particular theory, and that particular theory ended up being a dead end.
Well, that particular theory, but I don't think it's a dead end to let's say reduce matter to geometry. I think that's where I think that's all we can do. I think geometry and structure is basically all there is in a way. I kind of basically subscribe to that at this point, because what does it mean to say matter? It just means that there's there's something. It's kind of like a friction, or like a kind of a friction's not a good word, but it's something. It's a recalcitrance to reduction. What exists is whatever is hard to reduce to other things. So when you have to, this idea that comes out of this idea in Daniel Dennett, of real patterns. And what is real is the pattern in something that resists being reduced to something simpler. The fact that there is a difficulty in reducing it is, that's the thing. That is the thing.
So from the perspective of Duchamp and Pynchon, they both editorially seem to suggest that the impulse to reduce things to geometry reveals fundamental assumptions which can be challenged. Duchamp parodying both cubism and futurism in The Bride Descending a Staircase was to poke fun at both those schools. For Pynchon, the act of reducing events into reversible models, like, I don't know if you know Gravity's Rainbow, but Pointsman wants to reduce the relationship between Slothrop's sexual dalliances and the explosion of V2 rockets on London in a causal relationship based on a grid, which happens to be 8 chessboards on a side. I just happen to know 576 squares. Whereas Roger Mexico employs Poissonic equations in order to juxtapose, correlate those
So you're
events.
talking about then the difference between the kind of like continuous versus discrete question.
Exactly, with respect to the continuum and with respect to imminence, phase space, for example, as opposed to calculus.
Like one way of thinking about it is that, the continuum, you can, like, for example, topology, the science, the geometry of continuous transformations and continuous spaces, fields and manifolds and whatnot,
right,
is reducible to set theory. So when when you see that, it's not the kind of question between, I think it's just kind of like not such an important question whether you're dealing with this whether you have a wave function or whether you have a Hilbert space. We're still talking about the same thing.
It's the attitude towards time that differentiates extrapolations from calculus versus the contribution of phase space. So let me make the second point, and I think there's a relationship between the two, but you can decide whether you want to follow it up. It has to do with reductionism as a project, and that is the hard wires. And I was just talking about that, the hard wires from the cochlea directly to the motor regions that bypass the areas in the prefrontal and frontal cortex, which process oral stimuli and gets filtered through executive function, for which there's a lag of time between the reception of the stimuli and its register with executive function, with self-conscious awareness. And that lag of time really prevents jazz musicians from being in the moment.
Mm-hmm.
But it's been hypothesized, I think, and there is some evidence, empirical evidence, that jazz musicians utilize flight or fight startle reflexes to bypass that lag of time in order to directly react instinctually, in order to demonstrate the difference between what Varela calls the 1/10 very fast forms of cognition and the 10 scale forms of slow cognition, or what Kahneman calls thinking fast, thinking slow.
Right. No, I mean, that's clear.
And so, let me follow it up with one other thing, which suggests that there's another dimension to your discussion of evolution and the reduction of evolution to hormones and hardwires, and that is that there's empirical evidence of neuroplasticity with those hard wires in jazz musicians versus I forgot the expression from Little People from Blade Runner. That jazz musicians have made the evolutionary choice to convert those hard wires so that what they experience is intense pleasure rather than intense anxiety, threat, and so forth.
Interesting. Yeah.
Which puts evolutionary pressure on the project of aesthetics for human evolution. And I think there's a relationship between the reductionism to geometry and the reductionism to hormones and hardwires. However, I'm not denying their role. I'm just saying that the picture is more complex and that there may be environmental elements
Well, let me
in
just
a
say,
poetic sense that contributes pressure on the organism to evolve.
to avoid, confusion about this, I don't think that we're, absolutely determined by these things. It's just that there are these tendencies, and of course, on every time evolution creates a faculty by kind of teasing it out of what's there, of the interaction with the environment over many generations. Each time that happens, there are new affordances that we're not, that evolution doesn't know, it's not directed in any way.
There's no end game. There's
no end game.
no
It's
end
just,
point.
so then there's all these openings,
Yeah.
new potentials that happen. So that's, complexity theory and all that. I still subscribe to that, of course, but and in fact, I mean, the thrust of what I'm talking about is basically that we need to overcome our evolutionary hardwiring, and that's by assessing it and by really figuring out how it works, and by
which is the role of skepticism.
it's not just going on our kind of first gut reaction and our hunches. I guess philosophy in some sense to begin with was doing a little bit of that, all this questioning, all this making explicit, we talked about that last time, and making explicit some of these prohibitions. But like the first Western philosophy was all about like saying, it seems like this is impossible. Why is it impossible? Is it really impossible like out there, or is it impossible because we're conditioned to see things this way or think things this way? So yeah.
Sorry to take up so much time. Thanks.
No,
Great
that's
talk.
really interesting.
Terrific talk.
Thank you. Renzo.
Yes, thank you very much, Alexander. Nice to hear you again. Very
Yeah, thank
interesting.
you for coming again.
Yes, thinking what Martin said, to continue with this, the sense of human that we are here involved in this, all the people here. You remind me a lot about Stigler's artificial stupidity paper that is very interesting, that notion, because Martin mentioned Varela's too, and Stigler mentioned too in the aspect of noetics. How do you see, Alexander, in that sense, in this human aspect, the cross between functions and faculties? Faculties thinking in the sense of Stiglerian thinking, how we think faculties in the exosomatic aspect, no? In this organological aspect, the faculties in the noetic and the aspect of these tertiary retentions that it was conserved in Stigler's after his death, before his death, sorry. How you in your own perception, your research can be consider this in this historical a priori that is using the sense of Hitler's you mentioned always or Derrida, no, in these inscriptions of language as a technology and inscription of symbolical aspect of relational, but more not causality. Causality is not very good faculties in the sense. Because when Martin mentioned Duchamp's, I remember, of course, immediately the fountain of Duchamp. No? For algorithm, a fountain is a fountain, but upside the fountain is on this causality of understanding the creativity aspect. How to take up this fountain is upside of the relation of how using the fountain. So this is my question for you, Alexander, and thank you very much again for your exquisite speech. I enjoy a lot too.
Thank you, Renzo. Yeah, I know I didn't speak directly to the question of posthumanism, and yeah, I mean, a lot of this stuff connects, I think, directly to the question, but when I think, yeah, I need to think. There's other than these obvious connections, there's some obvious connections, I think, like the idea of overcoming these evolutionary predispositions to see things in a certain way. And like I said last week, I mean, the whole project is about a kind of Promethean project, if you will, like a kind of idea of that we should, if we can, somehow take control of things such that things get better, such that we can overcome our kind of stupidity, our kind of repetitive stupidity. And yeah, I mean, there's something where I have changed, I would say, in the last 10 years, where my perspective has changed, is that I now have more respect for Bayesian thinking, whereas I was really concerned with art and aesthetics, 10 years ago. So a lot of my work had to do with that, and where there's this question, like, so right, I have still in front of me, I don't know if you still see the two kinds of skepticism, that my interest in this Pyrrhonism, this idea of a kind of suspension of judgment, came from a kind of my thinking on aesthetics, and this idea of, it's an old idea, and maybe it's an old-fashioned idea, but I think I still stick by it. I know a lot of thinkers no longer want art to be this, but I still think art still is somehow in this tension with technology, and this technology being this kind of incremental problem solving, or like figuring out the various ways that things can be connected together and do things in order to solve practical problems. There's a kind of practical relationship to it, and art being this impractical thing, like a technology that doesn't serve a purpose, or that, and that's a very hard thing to do. Like it turns out that's the whole kind of delicate balancing act, to make sure making an artwork not become a caricature, or to make sure that it's not, it stands for itself, is very hard to do. But I've become a little bit disillusioned with some philosophers who, including to a certain extent Bernard Stiegler, who was very influential for me, but who kind of kept things at the level of and impractical impasse, coming from Derrida, this aporetic, the aporia of like, we can't, there's nothing we can do, and yet we must, we must act, and yet there's nothing to do, like this kind of, it's this idea that the only there's a kind of moral stance, and the only kind of right way to be is offended by all these things, but none of the practical solutions are good enough. And then we need to stand in this, to like remain in this kind of superposition, let's say, in this coherent state. And that's what I wrote about in the OEI article, Stiegler in the Chinese Room. It's basically my kind of coming to terms with that. And so post-human, I mean, yeah, I started this talk by talking about the technological slowdown, and this idea that maybe the singularity isn't coming, that there's not going to be a singularity, or that the AI, we just don't know, whether AI is going to become this super intelligence. And for some people, it seems that a lot of the post-human rhetoric is, at least in this kind of transhumanist side of it, and not the kind of ecological or critical post-humanists. I mean, in this this kind of let's say rationalist side, where they're making predictions, Bayesian predictions about the future, and they just go crazy with it, like Nick Bostrom, and like they seem to have the whole future mapped out, and they know. It's almost as if we're caught in a double bind with our own future, where we have to do certain things. You can see some of these, like Yudkowsky, this guy from this AI alarmist as well, Eliezer Yudkowsky. You can see him like watching what he's saying while he's saying, in order to not offend Roko's basilisk or something, where they're afraid that they could be retroactively punished by the future AI because they said something against it or something. They're all kind of tiptoeing around this, and it's a very, very strange place to be. And I think those are the excesses of this kind of Bayesian thinking. I totally don't go there. And in fact, I'm still thinking that we need to just be pragmatic and just kind of assess our limitations and try to improve on them. And I see this AI as a kind of a potential way of doing that, rather than this thing that we should be just, locking up in a box and studying in isolation and whatnot. But yeah, I don't know what else to say about posthumanism.
I understand. That's okay. It's complicated, because
Yeah.
Talking about without representation.
But what is your take? Like, what would you?
Well, for a long time I was focused in Varela's in action to trying to understand what happened with our representation. What happened in the now, and what is the now means, or what I can know through the now. In what sense is outside of this? What is the limits around on that.
Mhm.
You know, so of course, pragmatism is as you mentioned, is will follow maybe of many of this. Or what we mean when we say intelligence. In which sense we're talking about intelligence? What kind of intelligence exists? What other kinds of intelligence exist, and how do we know about by this other kind of intelligence? So, I think I understand what your point, and for me it's difficult to say that too, because you know, it's very, when you say to somebody and say what the hell you talking about? It's irrational, rationality, you know. What is the rationality in this? What is the rationality? Rationality and rational aspects. It's only, you know, it's perspective. But of course, this is one way that I try to go. But of course, always in the sense of understanding our own comprehension of that, we are inside and outside in this aspect of theorizations, you know, how we communicate both aspects, you know, the noetic, the externality.
Yeah, that actually links very well with also Martin's question about, you know, early, when he mentioned thinking fast and thinking slow, this idea of, you know, what happens when you're thinking fast? You're not, you know, it is non-reflective.
Passive engagement.
We're kind of, yeah, and we're taking all these kinds of evolutionary shortcuts, let's say, and they're also called, you know, Gerd's Gigerenzer talks about, what does he call? What does he call it? It's
Hitler?
no, Gigerenzer.
Ah.
It's called, I think he calls it ecological reason or something, and it's this idea that we have hardwired, you know, these kinds of rules of thumb, these kinds of what's the word? These kind of like quick ways that there are not quick ways of calculating things that are not the optimal way of calculating things, but that work enough. You know, the evolution doesn't really find the optimal way of doing things. It just kind of works enough so that in the long run we can kind of get things, we can move along. And there's reason to believe that, like, the interesting thing about those rules of thumb is that they're a lot less computationally intensive. So like if we were, for example, like if like he uses this example of like catching a ball with like a baseball with a mitt, and it's coming, and you have to follow its curve, you know, and you have to adjust your position to it in order to catch it. And there's a kind of like basic rule of thumb that we tell all, you know, young people trying to catch balls is just keep your eye on the ball. Like, and it means like just keep the relationship between your hand and the ball constant, like, so just constantly adjust it, and then the ball eventually just lands in the mitt. And you know, if you were gonna if you had to do like calculus and calculate the actual function describing, you know, the movement of the ball in space, you would have to have a separate brain, you know, just like a separate processor just calculating that, and it would use up a lot of your precious nutrients, and it would generate heat, and it would have all these thermodynamic impacts. And that's why, you know, evolution doesn't do that. It kind of finds these shortcuts that are just good enough. They're not the best, they're not optimal, but they work, and they're actually more efficient, and they're more ecological in that sense. And there's something that you know, one redeeming, let's say, thing that I can say about continental philosophy, let's say, versus analytic philosophy, is that you know, there's a sense in which the slow kind of literary stream of consciousness, almost kind of writing, that slowly gets to a point and develops these landscapes of thought that are very slow again. Whereas in analytic philosophy and logic, you get all these very, very short texts with one point and very kind of to the point. And you know, the Anglo-Saxon kind of way of writing a paper versus the French or German way, or you know, the kind of where in an English paper will start by saying what they're going to talk about in the introduction, and then say it, and then in their conclusion say what they said, you know, so they say it 3 times every time. Whereas the French would just jump right in, and there's no table of contents, and they just jump right in, and you're immediately in this kind of and that's an interesting comparison, just to, because I think there might be some relationship with that, like this kind of, there's a kind of ecological rationality, this kind of slow rationality that happens on the level of multiple, on the level of culture, let's say, on the level of the like a trans individual kind of reasoning, that this kind of writing might be an example of. And I've toyed with it. I mean, it's actually related to what Robert Brandom says about, you know, he says, I don't know if there's readers of Brandom here, but they'll say, like, all of these skeptical problems like Wittgenstein or Kripkenstein, this idea that we talked about briefly there, that there's a gap, there's this non-linearity between the proposition and the proof, or between, you know, between one step and another. We seem to just jump to the next thing, and there's no continuity. And things don't, it might mean that words don't actually refer, they don't mean anything, that there's no semantics underpinning what we're saying and what we're thinking, and it's just random words and we're just acting out and all this. And he says, no, you know, don't worry about that, because there are kind of relationships of material incompatibility that the words we're using necessarily, because we're kind of like always kind of following rules and changing the rules at the same time by participating in language, by participating trans-individually with other actants. And so even if we can't see the bottom, we can't point to the semantics and say exactly what we mean, there's overall in the process, it's almost like we're just parts of this giant computational machine, this kind of giant oracle that ends up computing the way things will have been. And so I have some, you know, I have problems with it, but I also think that there's something to it. Yeah. Anyone else?
Yeah, I would like to catch you just prior to that, it was a marvelous presentation. I really liked it a lot, extremely stimulating. But just to catch on this this kind of beautiful figure of the oracle, I would like to come back to the aesthetics and the arts. And being a Canadian, I'm quite good about extractionism, and I would like to play around this concept, saying that, and maybe from the last week when you were talking about like maximum extraction of phenomena from each individual. And throughout all your speech, what I was concerned about is like, okay, but how do I act still? What I should do then? So much with Bayanism, it's you want to build, but so then I will build and things will be built, and people will go in them and they are going to build again. And I still, it's like no aim and all aim all together. So what I've conceived recently, it's something called personal art, or it's not what I've conceived, it's just like a very low level of art. You just do what you do. But being a professional artist, I realized that there was a vector being, sometimes I do institutional art and I invest all my time and energy to fulfill the goal to still have a career. Well, this is very personal. But then I never, with my professional training, attend to my personal needs of art. And actually, this is like the other side. It's the impertinence. It's the idiotic. It's the stupidity. We're talking about stupid. It's not stupid, but it's super idiosyncratic. But as such, with extractionism in mind, we are still not at task, maybe a bit, but about self-extraction and true self-representation in our expression of ourselves, actually, because there is an economical factor somewhere, as we need to be pertinent. But this pertinence is still a filter. So what is it there? Pure positive chaos, Bayonistic, to just express myself on, you see where I'm going. So is it just like entropic, or is it negentropic truly? I don't know. I have this flare that maybe it's wired in my brain that I shouldn't do it. I shouldn't express fully. But is it still just like biological evolution? I don't know.
Yeah. No, I see exactly where you're coming from. Having been through that myself, as an artist, seeking, recognition, and it's a complicated thing. There's several games that you can play, several kind of different structures that you can interact with. You can, and in the end, you can just make art for yourself and for your own enjoyment if you want to. And there's a question of, is that art still? Is that, if you only do it for yourself, if no one ever sees it? I've always been, it's actually something important in my book, in Aesthesis and Perceptronium, this question of, because it's like raw art or outsider art it's like a privileged example of what art can be. It's like a kind of limit case of art, where art that happens without anyone seeing it, or just the artist seeing it. And it usually isn't obviously it doesn't have the same constraints, and perhaps some evolutionary constraints kind of show up. For example, horror vacui, this idea that nature abhors a vacuum, where a lot of the outsider artists are kind of just fill the entire canvas, and they can't leave any space. They're not minimalists, right? All outsider artists are maximalists. That might be wrong now, but this was the idea back in the day. It's hard to be an outsider artist today, anyway. And of course, by interacting with the art world or the kind of the community, there's a kind of feedback loop, and it does format how you do things and what you do. And so it's a whole tension between, we're asked to find our own true voice or whatever, or the thing that makes our work particular and singular, and at the same time connect it with the rest. And in a sense, I think you can't find that singularity if you don't connect it with the rest, if you don't interact with the rest. So that's a huge question. I don't know if I can help, but I know where you're coming from.
Thank you.
Martin has his hand up. your sound is off. I can't hear.
I got it.
Yeah.
If there's nobody else that hasn't gone yet, I just want to make sure that I'm not stepping on anybody's toes here. So I was really interested by the art techne tension that you were expressing after the formal talk was over. And I was thinking about ways in which the merging of art and technology might also merge the expression and skepticism that divide that you were talking about as well. And I'm thinking of Eduardo Katz and also Maurice Benenham. I don't know if you've been following media art, computer art, bio art, whether you know those folks, but
Remember his name? Yeah.
yeah, you know, like for example, the glow in the dark rabbit Alba raises some really interesting questions, not the least of which is that people didn't want the rabbit, the engineers didn't want to release the rabbit into the wild because they didn't want to have the possibility of spreading its genes, which were altered with a glow in the dark Hydra sequence. But the fact that the rabbit glows in the dark means that it would be under high pressure for natural selection, to put it mildly, from predators.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting project. The other one is Maurice Benenham's Power Chess, which was a remarkable work of two artificially intelligent robots playing chess against each other, programmed in such a way that the decision-making was tuned to simulate that of humans and also to simulate emotion, exasperation and distraction and so forth. And there was a wonderful demonstration of that through Ars Electronica and a discussion. I've got the website for that, and that was a project that really interested me a lot. And I'm wondering where that fit into the way in which you separate techne and art.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, I think it's the same. I mean, I think maybe maybe it's even more obvious in those situations where you're taking, technological art, which is also kind of what I dabbled in when I was an artist. When I was kind of
But also,
robots and things, and
but specifically to merge creativity with skepticism in very
yeah. Well, I mean, it's like the artist is, it's like using this technology, but not for technological purposes. So for what purposes? Is it just pure kind of aesthetic pleasure? No, it's more complicated than that. It's like a complex. It's like a conceptual complex that creates a kind of almost like a crystal. It kind of freezes time, or it makes this idea of standing for itself, or Adorno's idea of aesthetic, what's the word? Shudder, this kind of
or what Deleuze calls a shock to thought.
shock to thought, yeah. But shudder is good because it's also it's this kind of in-between state of like not being able to act. It's like too many different directions, kind of this equipoise, and the skeptics would call this idea that you can't decide one way or another, you can't judge one way or another, because everything has its own, all the different views have their own points, and so you can't reduce it to one side or another. You can't collapse it onto one side. So you kind of keep it in this superposition. And I think that's what art, when it's technological, is kind of trying to do. It's not, it's practical in the sense, that's why I even say in one of my papers is called art as pure reason. It's because we often say that art was thought of as this unconditioned creativity, that's irrational, and it's just free, kind of creativity. But no, I would say it's not. It's actually hyper conditioned. It's trying to absolutely condition itself to the point where it no longer is, collapsible into one explanation or another, or one kind of.
Yeah, it's really what Duchamp called conceptual art, and I'm sure Maurice points. I mean, aside from the fact that Duchamp was a grandmaster in chess, I think there are real reverberations about that. Anyway, sorry to take up so much time, but I thought that was something I wanted to kind of pry open.
Let's hear from some of the other people being quiet there. Any questions? Anything really? Just also, I'd like to hear about your work and what you're doing, and it doesn't need to be directly connected. If you want to share.
I could continue on the example of Martin, and to maybe reinvest the question of the artist. The talk of Martin was really stimulating to me because it expressed how the artworks or the will of the artist produce this this shock you're talking about, but how we can be engineers of shock. And throughout all the posthumans lecture, I foresaw a possibility to transform the artist as more something like an engineer of acupuncture, and culture as an organism that you can stimulate somehow, somewhere, with certain patterns, and to change it from the within and from the without. The question that the teleological question I was interested in with is like institutional consciousness or macroorganism consciousness, or at least how do you speak to macroorganism? How do you know it's alive? How do you know it's thinking from an individual point of view? I believe the artworks can act as, let's say, not bombs, but shock therapy, and to awaken something, to start to just maybe notice that there's existence somewhere. So let's speak in mythological question to awaken the dragon. So to call upon your art, this the discussion itself of what art is. In time, I believe this can be contaminating through mimetic means. So within your art, you express the capacity to be conductive of other art making. And so I believe that within the artist right now, what's available in the digital era is reprogramming of the task of art itself as the task of the artist. So to widen architectural conceptual meaning of this conceptual complex. Yeah, exactly. I'm really attracted to your theories because they have a potential for chaos. There's a high chaos potential, and this it's like a labyrinth is a beautiful example, and I perceive labyrinth in this kind of magnification of thought. But if there's multi-dimensional labyrinths overlaying one another, how can we still see forward? Or is it just not a fog being even more opaque as we go forward? Yeah.
Yeah. The idea of chaos and fog and this is something I go into quite some depth in aesthesis and perceptronium. There's a relationship between aesthetics as such, like the aesthetics. I don't mean just the study of the beautiful, but like the study of how it is that we're able to take in, like to perceive anything at all, so this is kind of like more general approach to aesthesis. That's why I say aesthesis and not aesthetics, but it's related to how macroscopic systems, how for example, you mentioned fog, or we could talk about a cloud. There's kind of Boltzmann's idea of how in order to perceive something as complex as a cloud made up of millions of tiny particles, we don't, the fact that we see a cloud rather than particles has everything to do with this process of aesthesis. The fact that we're kind of seeing the forest for the trees, we see the macroscopic object rather than all the little pieces. And of course, and it has to do with what I was talking about here, this kind of reduction of these the complex world we live in, into these very narrow bandwidth pathways of communication and very like limited computational power. So where, for example, Noam Chomsky and those GoFi people have a point is that the ChatGPT is pretty smart, but it's this gigantic computer system, running on mega computers, like extremely powerful, and so it's pretty fast too. It's crazy is how it can come up with responses and be so sure of itself, but we do it with much less computational power. And the question is, how does that happen? There's something that happens, and it's a kind of reduction, it's a kind of a processing that happens that filters it down. Deleuze called it synthesis, this idea of compressing into very narrow bandwidth pathways. Art kind of plays around with that, but aesthetics and perception on their own, you can think of, experience, for lack of a better word, like the kind of conscious experience of like seeing a world before us, or experiencing a world and being there and feeling like you're in a place and something's happening. The mood of the place is some kind of synthesis, some kind of decoherence of this extremely like this giant complex that is, you know, the universe. And instead, you know, artistic interventions are interventions into this, into that. Or they're kind of working with that and making different things, different aspects of that come to the fore, let's say, or yeah.
But where I want to take in is I got only the fan-around concept of Pierce in mind, like at the start of the 20th in phenomenology. If you, as an artist, work, and that's what I do. Let's say I pre-work in my mind this fan-around, so I reorganize it, and then you induce it in an artwork, and that's what Cubism do. That's what Surrealism do, but only
Right.
on like the first semiological level. But if you carve out your own fan-around, you can then disseminate it through mimetic means in artwork. And what I would like to pretend at is to build up systems where you can produce an hyper fan-around for institutional means of government. So you can give out like vision processes to macroscopical units of organization. Because, and that would be maybe that's some AI things, or I don't know, but we used to communicate visions throughout, like right now, we explain with words, but if we can build up vision processes for macroorganism, we would access another epistemological kind of terrain landscape.
So what do you think about the kind of the GPT model? You know, you can ask it, you know, I don't know if it's GPT or other things, but these kinds of things, but you can ask, and there was a famous recently someone asked, it must have been GPT because it was just text-based, and they asked the GPT to produce poetry in the style of Nick Cave, and then Nick Cave came out and said, like, no, that's an insult to everything human or something, you know, it's horrible poetry. But, you know, in another sense, it was actually, you know, it was actually pretty close to what Nick Cave might produce. And so it got me thinking about this idea that that these models are somehow they do exist out there. And so what if we what if those aspects of the models are in fact kind of localizable, and what so if we could extract how the machine sees our own work, let's say if we produce a lot of artwork and then like the machine learns what it is we're doing, and it's some kind of shape, let's say, within the model, then maybe it could be helpful to kind of name it and say that's Nick Cave style, or that's this style, that's this style. All these styles that are a little bit more difficult to, these things that we say, oh, this is intangible because it's, you know, it's aesthetic and it's art, and you can't really reduce it to that. But and maybe that isn't really a reduction, it's just an imitation. Somehow it's a model, some kind of model. It's not a model that's immediately relatable to, like, we can't immediately say, oh yeah, that's obviously a model of this. If you just look at the neural net, you don't see anything. It's just, but you see it in its performance, in its actual production of some kind of artifact. So yeah, I mean, I think what you're saying should be part of the something like that should be part of the discussion. Like we do need to. I'm definitely kind of. Yeah. I mean, like politically speaking, I would say I'm like pro-state. You know, like in the sense that I'm not an anarchist. I'm kind of I do believe that we should aspire to creating some kind of overarching rule-based, structure, some kind of model that somehow helps us be better, helps us be less stupid, helps us see beyond our limitations and whatnot. I don't think that you can just leave it to nature for that to happen, because which would be, I would say, the anarchist perspective. The anarchist will say, no, like, let's stop all of this stuff and then stop being so technological and obviously capitalistic, but if we stop all that, then we'll go back to the old ways where we all used to care for each other and all used to be ecological and take care of our environments and whatnot. But I don't buy that. I think we need to go, we still need to go, one level up somehow. So that helps give a direction to, but so I would agree with something like that could be really interesting to make happen, and in a way it's already happening. These models, if they are studying everything that we're doing, there's some kind, there is an extraction happening that, everyone's looking themselves up, like people who've written a lot or our public figures are all like looking themselves up, like looking up their obituaries and things like that on GPT to say, like, what does my obituary look like? Yeah.
Necro narcissism must be a beautiful trend.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.